What if I told you that your story has the power to make our world a better place? Would you believe me? Would it make you want to share your story more? Well, my name is Matt Story, so I may be biased, but join me as I sit with leaders that are doing just that, sharing their stories of unique lived experiences that they've turned into superpowers that they now use to make a positive impact on our world. Welcome to Season 6 of What's Your Story podcast. I'm so excited to be with you again. I took a little bit of a break over the holidays to think about the podcast and really think about what I wanted to do in this upcoming season. And so you're going to see some new things. You're going to see a new format. You're going to see new questions. Obviously, you're going to see new guests. And I'm really excited for you to learn from these guests as I have learned from them and their stories and how they've been able to take their unique lived experience and really create superpowers that enable them to show up in different, interesting, productive, successful ways. And so I can't wait for you to hear the stories that I started to collect and that we'll be sharing throughout this season. And so while there's obviously, going to be some new things, new changes, always welcome any and all feedback that you may have on the podcast. What are you liking? What are you not liking? Who would you like to hear? What are guests that you would like to see? Always welcome those thoughts. But one thing that I realized as I was taking a bit of a break from the podcast and really focusing on rest is really understanding the importance of rest. And so one thing that really brought this to life is, for me, I've been on a fitness journey, probably over the last, I would say, committed 3.5-4 years or so. But in 2024, one of my main goals was consistency, because I believe the more consistent you are with your fitness, the easier it is to continue forward with it. And so I made the goal in 2024 that I would work out every single day. And that doesn't mean, doing some extreme, HIIT class, cycling, run. It also means stretching. It means yoga. It means walking, those type of things to keep your body in, good form and ensuring you're giving your body the appropriate things that it needs. But for me, I want to be consistent with movement. So it was a non-negotiable for me in the year to go through and ensure every day within 2024. I actually started earlier in 2023. And as I was tracking it, I got up to over 400 days. I actually made it to 412 days. But what I realized as I was setting my goals for this year related to fitness is, for me, I was hitting plateaus and I wasn't able to really see progress on, some of the, various strength things I was building against, or some of the speed goals that I had. And what I recognized is, well, yes, consistency was an important goal for me, just to kind of get that practice and to have that space to have movement in every single day. I really need to understand what role was rest playing in my plan. And what I realized is I was prioritizing just checking the box for movement in that one day over, in some cases, where I should have been really listening to taking a step back, recovery, allowing my full system to come to a rest state. And what I've done this year is I'm going to give myself that freedom, if you will, to allow the body to rest. And I think for me, what I had to overcome, and some of you may also suffer with this, I had to overcome this idea of you earn rest. And so, the reason I rest is because I went so hard the day before. And I actually flipped that on its head and really started to think about, in order for me to go hard, in order for me to hit those new PRs, in order for me to hit those new strength goals, I need rest. And I have to have that time to allow myself to recover. And so the idea that you earn rest is one that is false. And it's one that I probably spent the last 412 days inaccurately applying to my fitness goals. And as I thought about more broadly, we also do that in our professional life. We also do that in our personal life with family and friends. And I think a lot of us, whether you're a parent, whether you're a sibling, whether you're a kid, you can sometimes think that you need to be there at all times for your family members. You need to be there at all times for your projects, for your teams that you work with. But really understanding that rest is a key component to allowing us to get to that goal, allowing us to get to that next phase, get to that next step. And it's not something you have to go through a significant amount of challenge or hurdles or obstacles to earn, but really we have to factor it in to the overarching plan. And so for me going into this year, I'm going to incorporate more rest days, both in my fitness, but also in just overall. That means, unplugging. That means not necessarily listening to a podcast every time I take a little bit of a break and walk or go do something, or I'm washing the dishes, and allowing myself to get to that recovery state is going to be really important for me in this year. And so I just wanted to share that because I know a lot of us in the beginning of the year are, we've kind of gone through the goal setting, and now the rubber's hitting the road on, like, are we actually getting closer to those goals we set out for ourselves? And, are we getting closer to being that person that we ultimately want to be? And I know for me, having rest as a key component of the ingredients needed to get there is something that's going to be a differentiator. So I share that. Hopefully that's something that you can take away and use in your own plans. And I just would love to hear from you. Like, how are you setting yourself up for success? How are you going after goals? And also, what role do you think rest could play in helping you reach those ultimate goals? My guest on the pod this week is a former C-suite executive for commercial real estate, professional services, and technology companies that is now living his best portfolio life as a board director and advisor to multiple companies making waves with disruptive business models. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about his story. So please welcome Craig Robinson to the show.
Matt, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for jumping on. Before we get into hearing more about your story and your journey, I'm curious if you could take us back and maybe give us a little story about what little Craig may have been like.
Little Craig. First and foremost, little Craig's still here. My inner child is with me. He's on this podcast right now, and I embrace that little fella. And it's interesting because everyone thinks about their story almost from the point where success was inevitable, but you got to go back to those formative years. I grew up in Atlanta, in a city that is, and certainly was then for me, an all Black city. Everyone that I knew, every experience that I had was largely through that experience, and it was a beautiful one. But there were many aspects of my childhood that were tough. My father left when I was pretty young, and my mom had a really difficult time, but did the best she could. But but it was all we knew, and so when I think back on my early years, when I was in my room with my headphones on, reading comic books, I was a dreamer. I was a creator. I was a kid who would get lost sketching and drawing and imagining, and that was my way of escaping, but that was also my source of joy. My mom would always tell her friends, "You've got to watch out for Craig," because I was, I was witty and I was clap back with her, and she, that was something that we encouraged back then. But those are all things that, when I think about my inner child, were very much me. But most of all, I think what continued on and is still with me now is I was always curious. I always challenged a lot of the conventional thinking, which sometimes got me in trouble. But later in life, it served me well. And I think most of all, notwithstanding the fact that it was a tough environment, I was an optimist. And I think that dreamer part of me is something that's still with me. And but it was definitely forged in Southwest Atlanta.
Well, it's interesting to think about, you use words like dreamer, optimist, curiosity. How do you feel growing up in Atlanta fostered that in you? And kind of, as you mentioned, being surrounded by a community of probably leaders and individuals you looked up to that look like you. How do you think that poured into you and gave you that ability to dream and that ability to be curious?
In our fight to overturn separate but equal, a lot of the research showed that separate environments actually bred a sense of inferiority, and separate wasn't actually equal, and sometimes separate could be very negative. But there was an aspect to growing up in the city where all of my teachers were Black. The mayor, since 1972 till now, nonstop has been African American, and not just the mayor, the commissioners, the city council. I did not know a world where Black excellence wasn't a thing. And some would say that was naive not to understand the real world, air quote, or at least the bigger world, or the world outside of the bubble that now we refer to as Wakanda. But in that time, all I knew was possible. And I had people every day tell me that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And it wasn't until later in life that I learned about the headwinds. And then I even learned that there were headwinds that I was, flying through even then, But, I think that when I later left Atlanta and I went to MIT as an undergrad, and that was my first experience being in an environment where I went from being one of the majority to being one of the few, that I began to realize that I needed, and so much of what had been sown into me as a child was now really necessary to have the fortitude to push through those environments, to kind of remember, oh, I can do this. I'm supposed to be here. I've been prepared for this. And I think growing up in that environment was really, really healthy, and I'm grateful for. And I imagine it's not the same, but maybe those who had an opportunity to go to HBCUs, I did not, but found that experience later in life to just be around amazing, beautiful, smart people who looked like you, and professors who poured into you and cared about you. That was the experience that I had growing up, and I'm really grateful for it.
Well, this may be a double click into that, because you attended MIT and then you went on to HBS for your graduate studies. And so I'm curious, beyond the degrees from those illustrious 3-letter, well-known universities, what did you take away from it beyond the schooling, beyond the degree?
Those 3 letters, to be clear, when I was growing up, I didn't even know about those 3 letters. I didn't even know MIT was a thing until my calculus teacher told me to go down to the cafeteria and talk to this recruiter from this school, and I didn't even know what MIT was. So just to be clear, the meaning and the power of those networks and those institutions became more clear to me later in life. But I will tell you, I'm a Gen Xer, and I think a lot of Gen Xers grew up under the tutelage and under the shadow of boomers, and we largely did what was thought was the best thing to do. If you're good in math, you should be an engineer. If you're good in science, you go be a doctor. If you're good in this, you should do this. And our life was largely defined by what we should do. And that includes what schools you should go to, what careers you should do. And I would say MIT, while an amazing experience for me, was really an act of what I should do. And when I got to MIT, I realized that I actually was not really passionate about being an engineer or technology. I was passionate about people. I was class president for 2 years. I was very active on campus. I was very active and committed to social movements. But that really wasn't the type of thing you think to do at MIT. But I was, those are the types of things that I started to notice and pay attention. So by the time I had a chance to think about school again, it was now, what do I want to do? What are the things I want to do? And I was initially really excited about the idea of urban renewal, economic development, and coming back to a city like Atlanta and being a part of its redevelopment, because there were parts like where I grew up that weren't so great. And that's what led me to go to HBS. This was my pivot. This was my first intentional move to say, hey, I want to do something different with my life. And I think I need different skill sets. I need different networks to do it. But I'm going to be doing it for me and what I want to do, not what I should do. And that, by the way, has continued to be a thread, because it's a working hypothesis. You think this is what you want to do, but until you can test the hypothesis, you don't know. But that was really what those 2 institutions did for me, is they really helped me test the hypothesis. And, I think it's working out.
Well, it's interesting because I think about it in terms of, as you mentioned, you grow up, your parents, grandparents, they put this idea of, this is the road you should get on. And as long as you stay on that road, the outcomes are going to be good. And I think a lot of us get to the point where you look around on the road and you're like, well, why am I on this road? And it's like, I know the destination is good, but like, why am I here? And then you make a shift to creating your own path. And it comes with that ability to, like you said, to make those pivots, to make those choices that send you down a different journey that necessarily wasn't what they told you to do, but for whatever reason, you're called to do it. And I think the sooner in your career, in your journey, you can get to your own path, the more fulfilled you are. And then I think that's really where you start to be able to play with your own, whether it's superpowers, whether it's, your capability, skill set. That's truly where they turn on.
100%. And there's a luxury that goes with being able to, being kind of, conscious, willing, able to solve for fulfillment versus existence, contentment, or kind of, I think as our parents and the generations before us, that was a luxury, joy, happiness, those weren't things that, I think they felt they had permission to. It was one, what is available to me? What is the least risky? What is the best way I have to provide for myself and my family? And you and I are of the generation, as certainly millennials and the Z's after them, that are now solving for higher order, kind of goals and outcomes, which I think largely are happiness, fulfillment, purpose, not just work, not a career that provides a lifestyle. And for those of us who figure that out at enough time with enough time left on the clock, you're grateful. And I think you started the call with just the portfolio life. That was the most recent pivot for me, is realizing, hey, I still have time left. What is it that would, give me joy, would give me purpose, give me belonging? It still puts the skills and talents that I have to use, but doing it in a way that gives me joy. And that's a lot of talk right now in the news about joy, but that's a real thing. And so I think that's, where we are today, hopefully in society, but certainly in our lives.
So I do want to get into your professional journey, and I'm curious, was getting to the C-suite always the path you wanted to take? Was that the destination that you were aiming for, or did you have other ideas of where you were going to go and apply those abilities?
Matt, I'm going to be honest, because it's now more comical than it is embarrassing. But there's once a time where I thought I would be a politician. I was going to go back, get an MBA, come back to Atlanta, be a part of urban renewal, bringing jobs and creating opportunities, and then I would eventually get into some world of public service. But the professional part for public service was to be a developer, a real estate developer, investor. And when I got out of B school, the market was like crashing. So there wasn't a lot of investment development opportunities. And so I found myself doing real estate services and advisory, which wasn't considered the sexy thing. And for many, it still isn't. But in the process of doing this interim thing, like until the market recovers, I found out that I really, really love leadership. I really love people. I love teams, loved a whole lot of things that were not part of what you'd thought of for a traditional real estate investor who's building office buildings and malls and hotels and that type of stuff. I started, learning about other parts of the industry, which gave rise to being a general manager, being a division president. And, and that was the flywheel of, I realized that I loved building, growing, scaling organizations. My first one was, I was 35 and I had not run anything in my life besides myself, barely. And I had an opportunity to go be a division president in a company that was a roll up, and I didn't know anything about the company, didn't have a brand. It was a new company, and they took a run on me. I took a run on them. And 4 years later, we sold the company to a private equity buyer, and I was a part of that process. And I was hooked. And then I had a chance to go, once we had a successful, kind of exit there, I ran $1 billion business, and now I'm 39. So I'm still not even 40, and I'm, having success running these businesses. And when I look back on some of the businesses, what made them interesting to me and maybe me a good fit for them, one is timing. Always is timing. There's a lot of luck. I had great mentors and all of that who helped me avoid all the big potholes, which there were many. But these were all challenger brands. These were all companies that were like, they were C companies trying to be a B company, or B trying to be an A. And as a result, they were willing to take a chance with someone like me as one of their leaders. And it was an exciting canvas for me to paint on. And I love those. And so all of my operating kind of P&L C-suite roles have been in challenger brands, growth companies. And that really has been, and I've done some of that economic development, real estate stuff. I have done some of that, but by and large, the marketplace knows me for the stuff that I've done kind of on the executive side.
Well, I want to talk about your pivot to moving into more boards, advisory. But before we get into that, I'd love it if you could define, what does portfolio life mean to you?
Yeah.
Because I actually think it's something that more people are going to be drawn to. I think it's something that will be a more common practice than it to be the exception. But I would love for you to define what that is for you.
Yeah. Listen, it's actually a term. There's a, long before I knew it was a term, there's a professor at HBS, her name is Christina Wallace. She wrote a book called Portfolio Life. But before I read the book, I'd already started kind of believing that you did not have to have one job, one career, one thing that defined who you are. I have a lot of capacity. And so the idea that I could, not only diversify the organizations that I work with, but diversify the economics, diversify the risk. So in plain speak, what I'm doing is I spend some time with early startups as an advisor. I'm on 4 boards, all that are private companies. So it gives me a lot of opportunity to think about how to build and scale companies and bring some of that knowledge. Some are venture backed, some are private equity. So that's a very different dynamic. I coach some CEOs who are thinking about how to scale their businesses, how to exit. And so I literally, Matt, in a course of a day, I might be dealing with a startup issue. I might be thinking about an exit issue. I'm thinking about a governance issue. And then I'm also thinking about maybe teaching an agile course at a business school. And for me, I'm way more, I feel way more alive. My energy is great. Everything I'm doing, it's what I want to do. And the things that I do align with the things I think I'm good at. So versus like having a job where I'm burdened with a lot of things I don't want to do or some things I'm not good at, and maybe taking all of my economic risk and putting it in one company, I'm kind of diversifying it. And I'll tell you, Matt, a lot of people say, Craig, you're too young for that. Oh my God, that's what you're supposed to do when you retire. Like, no, actually it's not, because this is something I could do, indefinitely. So why would I wait until I've got like a few years of of content left to like start spreading the seeds? And, and none of this, prevents you from ever, taking 90% of your effort and putting it into one organization if you want to. But really right now, I'm finding a lot of joy in that. I'm finding it sustainable work-life balance. But most of all, it allows me to put the center of my life, my joy, and the things that matter to me, versus having those things get the remainder, that they come first.
Obviously it's smart for you, but I also think it's smart for everyone you engage with, whether it be as an advisor, board member, coach, because not only do they get to tap into your previous C-suite experience, but now they're tapping into what you're talking about in all those various things that you're getting pulled into. And the idea of connecting dots that they may not see, you're able to do that for them. And so again, I think it's truly, it works two ways, because it's easy to say, oh, of course you want to be putting your eggs in different baskets, but it actually makes you a better advisor. It makes you a better board member, right, because you're pulling from all of that. Exactly. But you mentioned doing it earlier than most people would expect. How did you know it was the right time? Like you probably had to make a decision at some point and say, I'm going to make this pivot.
Yeah.
But what was whether it was the sign, you got a spidey sense, what was the thing that really gave you that like indicator, like, okay, I'm going to do this?
Yeah. So great question. There are 2 things. One, there was a moment after the murder of George Floyd when, there was a lot of interest in people like you and I possibly going onto boards. People acknowledged there wasn't much diversity on corporate boards, and people woke up and said, we got to do something about it. And I went from not being of interest to any of these companies to now, folks were ringing my phone. And it was also a time when there were a lot of venture-backed companies that flooded with capital, were expecting IPOs and expecting SPACs. And so people were feeling now is the time to really start bringing on independent directors. So there was a moment where I had the inbound opportunities, and there were enough of them for me to even think, And once I did, I went on 2 boards, and I said, I really like this. And I still had an operating job. And I would find myself getting excited to go to my board meetings. And then I'd be like, I got to go back to work. But I'm excited to go to my board meetings. I'm excited about my advisory stuff. And I had like maybe a year or 2 where I was like I was the C-suite exec at a real estate company. I was doing some advisory stuff and my board stuff. And I said, I wonder if I could just do this full time. I literally just did the math. I like sketched it out and I like started thinking about it. And I kind of said, there's no way I can do this portfolio life unless I really commit to it. And it's kind of like trying to do half in, half out. I'm going to exhaust myself and not do any of it really well. And so I took a moment and I said, I'm going to give it a try. And I can remember being on the plane, writing down like just thoughts and sketching. And I said, give myself a year and a half to see if I could amass enough meaningful, interesting things and a portfolio that would encourage me to stick with it versus going back into another operating role. And it's been 2 years, and I'm more busy than I'd ever thought I'd be, and I've had some really great operating roles come back my way, like CEO things, and it's been interesting. The part of me that answered the phone each time I got one of those calls was my ego. My ego, like, oh, I'm built to do that one thing, but I'm happy. And you have to ask yourself, like, really, is your authentic self answering the phone or your ego? And so far, fortunately, I've been able to just kind of stay true and make sure whatever I do, whatever that is based on my authentic self.
It's beautiful to hear that kind of you're able to put that in a place, because I think we can sometimes, whether it's titles, whether it's organizations, it's money, we can sometimes, that becomes the object. But I know for a fact, and myself and all the people I talk to, once you get it, it's only good for a little bit of amount of time. And then it's like, it's just another job. It's just another thing. But it sounds like you've been able to find this mixture of things that actually bring you joy, but you're also impacting people in a way that makes a difference, which is something that doesn't go away. Like that remains beyond the initial, high or what have you. Which takes me to my next question. So you're an advocate for racial equity. How have you been able to make an impact there, given your expertise in real estate development and urban renewal? Because I know that like disparity is huge when it comes to that space. So I'm just curious, how have you been able to make a difference there?
The first thing we have to realize is that there are no silver bullets. There's silver buckshots. And once you find one of the battlefronts in the war, and there are many battlefronts where you can advance the line, then you hold that line, you own that line. My line has been in my industry. It has been in the corporate spaces. It's been in the influence that I've had. And it may not go noticed in the history books, but it's felt very meaningful in my life. I have largely focused my efforts in a few different ways. One is I was a founding member of an organization called the Leadership Now Project, which was about getting business leaders to be vocal, active, leveraging their platforms to protect and preserve and promote our democracy, particularly making sure it works for all of us. And here in the state of Georgia, but many states like Georgia, where we've actually seen our right to vote, our right to participate, and our democracy threatened and undermined. That's been an area where I'm really, really passionate. And actually, full circle, going back to politics, that's how I'm involved with politics, is making sure it works for people like you and I. Number two, I feel that if you have an opportunity to sit in the room, either at a VP, SVP, C-suite, or board seat, and you are not an advocate either as an ally or as someone who has a lived experience of knowing why DEI is important, then you shouldn't be in that room. You should not be in that room, to be honest, because in fact, you may very well be a part of the problem by being silent, because you might be the only one in that room who could raise the issue. And I've been in rooms where I'm the only one, and I say, hey, what are we doing to look at our pipeline of talent to make sure that we're going to have diverse candidates for the next 3 roles that we're going to hire for? And I could just see like the glaze over people's eyes, like they'd never thought about it. And it may not be nefarious. It may not be from a bad place. It's just like my role is to like bring awareness to this and not let people forget. And so when I do that in my boardrooms, I do that in my C-suites. And then when I've had the direct responsibility to hire or fire or to promote or to pick or to like engage, I I'm not shy about doing that. And I have found, sadly enough, that sometimes, we're so fearful, and we're so worried about spending the little bit of political capital that we have, that we covet it, and we end up never spending it because we overthink, when am I going to make this call for this person, and when am I going to speak out? And you're waiting for this perfect moment, and you end up never doing anything. And when I think about some of the giants, we talked about Atlanta, Maynard Jackson was the first African-American mayor of a southern city, and was the mayor of Atlanta. And one of the things that made him prolific in Atlanta was he used his political capital to create economic opportunities for a number of Black entrepreneurs, specifically real estate developers like H.D. Russell and many others. And he used his capital to create, set aside contracts for all of the city work. And you would have said, hey, the first time being a Black mayor, play nice, get along, don't ruffle the feathers. That would have been the most obvious playbook to run. Anyone would have just said, hey, the next generation, they'll take it a little bit further. He threw a Hail Mary pass, and it landed. And as a result, he created generations of opportunities for people. But he also modeled the behavior for other leaders. And so I'd like to do that, and I consider myself in my own walk doing that type of work. Maybe not as lion as Maynard Jackson. I don't want to put myself in that level, but in my own way.
No. It's the Beyonce effect. And what I refer to is that we all have 24 hours in a day, but Beyonce's impact is much larger than mine. And so I'm just trying to close the gap. I may not ever get to her level, but if I can increase my impact day by day, moment by moment, I'm doing something. And it sounds like you're doing the exact same thing of making impact. And it doesn't have to be, which is, again, it's the reason I do this podcast, is because these are the stories that aren't going to be the front of a newspaper. They're not going to be at the top of the news, but they're felt, and people are going to be better for them. And so I think anytime, and I love what you said, anybody that's in a leadership role has a responsibility to be that voice, because if you don't, it's not a guarantee that somebody else will. And I think that with any gain capital you get, whether it's, in an organization, actual material capital, what have you, you should be thinking about how you could use that to help others. So complete align there. So you said something in our pre-interview call, which it hasn't left my head. And you said an airplane's ability to stay in the air has more to do with its flexibility than that versus the rigidity of the structure that we tend to think of what keeps in there, the engine and, the steel and whatnot. And so I'm curious, how should we all be thinking about that in our own journeys and taking that practice and applying it in our lives?
The Homo sapien is not an apex predator because it's stronger or faster or any of those things. It just has proven the ability to adapt very well. And in our own lives, I think whenever we find the strength, the resolve, the courage to adapt, that is a thing. And I'll tell you why that's even more an issue today is we are approaching almost everything in our life today with conviction when we should be approaching it with curiosity. We show up in every conversation, whether it's about our politics, about our values, about lifestyles, about our professional journeys. And we have more conviction than we have curiosity. And I think our ability to adapt really is predicated on your ability to take a step back and constantly reassess, take in new information. Adam Grant wrote a book called Think Again, where he talks about all the ways in which we in our mind block out new ideas because we're in love with our own ideas. And so we're constantly prosecuting, politicking, preaching all of the new ideas away. And so I really nudge and encourage everyone to really think about how do you approach your life with more curiosity than conviction. And specifically, as I think about it in my own life, it's been my willingness to pivot. Why are you doing this? No, why are you doing this? For real. And once you just pause long enough to realize, like, actually the data that's informing this decision is not the data, or it's not my data, it's someone else's data, or there's new data. then you give yourself permission to change and adapt. And I think the more rigid you are, conviction, the more likely things, don't work and you don't adapt. So I believe that, and and I wish more of us did.
No, I love that, having more curiosity than conviction. Because I think if everyone started from a place of curiosity, you'd be surprised how much more we have in common. And it just yeah. But on that thread, you have a book in the works, and I'm curious. You got a lot going on. Sounds like your days are busy. Why to add author to that list of titles that you're already carrying around? And also, if you could just share a little bit about what the book's about and how your ideas you're presenting in it.
This is my therapy out loud, right? What started out is me thinking and wrestling and introspecting and dealing with the pain of like coming to some of these places where I've replaced conviction with curiosity. This book has given me an opportunity, first and foremost for me, to like take all of this and like put it in, and organize it in a way where it makes sense. Like I can now like draw a line through the scatter plot, and I can see the correlation and the causality and the relationship between all of these different things. And so one, it's been helpful for me. Number two, Matt, when I have conversations, honest, authentic, safe space conversations with people like yourself and others, one, first and foremost, by being vulnerable. Like, I don't know, I'm trying to figure it out. People are vulnerable with me, and we learn, and we realize we're all struggling with some of the same stuff. Like, would you really? I've been making it. And I'm realizing that anything I could do to help someone, not give them the answer, because I don't think that's helpful at all, but just like, here are the questions that I'm asking myself, and here's how I've thought about answering them. The book is going to give really every reader an opportunity to have a conversation with themselves. Like, why do you believe what you believe? How does this belief system impact your happiness and your sense of purpose? And I'll tell you, in short, I think there are three areas of our life where we are most defensive of our core ideology, our core beliefs, our conviction. It's around our career. Why? We spend 90,000 hours in our life doing it. It's a big part of our identity. It's a big part of our ego. It's a big part of our livelihood. You made big decisions about your career when you were probably 13, 15, 16, 17, 18. And you have a bias towards, seeing it through. And I said, wait, let's go back and revisit some of these assumptions. Your relationships with our loved ones, our family, our spouses, our partners. There are a lot of things that society and institutions tell us about how to think about love, how to think about our relationships that are oftentimes not in service of our own joy and our happiness. And then lastly, faith is an area where it's become politicized, and a lot of what could be a very powerful source of joy has become a really source of division. And if I had to say at a kind of a synthesized level, this is all about how to find and reclaim your joy, your happiness, by looking at all of the things that we have put in place between us and our happiness, that we've done with virtue, that we've done with conviction, that we've done because we thought we were supposed to, or we've allowed an institution to do it. And this book is about removing those blockages, removing the things that are standing between us and our happiness, sometimes that are of our own doing. So I'm really, really, really excited about it. It's been my own journey, and I hope when the book is done, it'll be helpful for others as well.
I want to reflect on your journey a little bit and ask a few questions. What would you say has been your mama we made it moment, or your greatest achievement so far?
I'll say there have been some out loud moments, and there have been some quiet moments. The quiet moment was me deciding to put my joy and my happiness first, and walking away, at least the way it looks from the outside, from some of the more traditional stuff, and saying, Craig, good for you, man. You said you believe these things. You said these things were important to you, and you're committed to it, and I'm proud of you. So that's me talking to my inner child, my inner elder, all of myself, and saying this was a moment of where you resisted the tides of society. And then there have been some like really cool moments where I grew up in Southwest Atlanta, not the best part of Southwest Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And I found myself in some pretty cool rooms. Like, I'll never forget, I was a keynote speaker for a conference, and so was Colin Powell. And I came out right before Colin Powell, but before we were both in the green room in the back. And this is the first time Trump ran for president. And I remember just talking to, it was just me and him, and he's eating a Dunkin' Donut, having some coffee. And I'm like, I'm chewing the fat with the general here.
Yeah.
And we're just talking, man. And I'm like, man, I'm from Southwest Atlanta, and I'm talking to the general. And I asked him, I was like, why don't you run for president? I'm talking to him, and he's talking to me like his grandson or something. And I've had some really cool moments like that where I look back and just said, wow, man, I've been very blessed. I've been very fortunate to be in rooms, to be in spaces, to live, to see some things that we thought we'd never see, like a Black president, and maybe now the first female president. And I'm grateful. I think about my great grandfather, who was born 1860, maybe 45 minutes north of where I am sitting today, enslaved. He went on to be a free man. Not only a free man, he started a business, a church, which is actually still in existence today, and a school, and was also a trustee at Morse Brown. And I think about, a few generations ago, the man who I carry the DNA of was born enslaved. And here I am having the opportunity to sit and have this conversation with you, Matt. Just 45 minutes where he was enslaved, and where many of my ancestors were enslaved in the exact same state. And that's one of those moments where you're just like, wow, what might we see 100 years from now? What might, generations after me be able to do and see, and what can I be a part of to make it happen?
I think what's interesting, what I'm getting away from you, is that you're very self-aware. And a lot of that's driven by, you spend time with yourself, and you spend time talking to yourself and asking the tough questions of yourself, which I don't know that that's a normal thing. I don't know that many people, we tend to run away from those conversations because we tend to have to look at, in the dark places. We tend to have to ask the questions that we don't really want to answer.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a skill that all of us can get better at. But I'm curious, as you've been talking to yourself, being self-aware, what has been your biggest mistake?
Man, thank God for therapy, which I'm a big believer in. I don't think a lot of the stuff that I've wrestled with, and I'm still wrestling with, Matt, like I'm not there, man. I'm like, there's still things, there's still triggers, there's still a moment where you're just like, am I good enough? Am I doing the right thing? All of that's still there. It's always a cloud. It's not too far behind. But I will say the big rocks that I've been moving out my life, with, spending so much of my life as a pleaser. And some of that was the generation I grew up in, and some of that was just the way I experienced love as a child, is, it is being a pleaser, and also the need for success. And because that was the other way in which I experienced love and attention, and I felt seen, and I felt valued. And when you remove those two things, it can be a very naked feeling. And so sitting in those spaces, being able to find other sources of self-love, other sources of value and purpose, that's been one of the things that has been really important to me. And I'm a Sagittarius, I'm an extrovert, I'm a talker. So the way you describe me, some of my friends would be like, Craig, like, really? But Matt, to be honest with you, I've become more like the guy you're describing than I was, to be honest with you. Yeah. And I'll tell you, this is going to sound, kind of superficial, but it's important. I lived in New York for 12 years. It was a great season of my life. Everyone in my environment, they were all hustling. Everybody's like on the grind. Everybody's climbing. And I physically just surrounded myself with a community of people who were doing some of the things that I actually did not want to do anymore. So one of the other things I have found valuable is just to actually physically put myself in community, in spaces that nurture and reinforce the values that are now important to me. So I moved back to Atlanta, and, it turns out that trees and clouds and clean sidewalks and people, and there's just so many other things that go into my happiness quotient. But most of all, I'm doing what I can physically to remove the triggers that take me back to some of my old behaviors. But it's a journey, man, and it's work. And I have to sit with a lot of stuff, but I'm enjoying the journey. I'm enjoying the process. And, And the good news, last thing is I'll say is it seems to be on vogue now. Like everybody wants to do self work, and if you're in a dating app, people are like, please be whole and healed. And it's like, is that like something you could put on LinkedIn? Like, I'm whole and healed now. Can someone please go and validate that on my
Yeah,
LinkedIn?
certified.
Me that I'm whole. No, it's an ongoing process. There's generational trauma. We don't have old trauma that we're healing from. We continue to have new trauma every day, man. And so it's also too, I think, the work of life to constantly be purging. When you go to sleep at night, your body shuts down and your cells purge all the impurities out of your body. We have to do that almost while we're awake as well.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that you are a direct product of what you surround yourself with, whether that's the people, the environment, the things you're ingesting. I think that all determines your outlook on life. It determines how you view the world. I recently just came back from a trip with some of my buddies, and these are 20-year friendships, 20+ year friendships. And to see where we've evolved from being, these know nothing kids to families and leaders and doing all these things. And I just like to absorb that and to just be in a place of like celebrating, oh, you're about to have another kid, or, oh, you got that promotion. Oh, you're doing this, which again, some of it is worldly credits or success, but just to be able to enjoy it and to celebrate it as a group is actually more fun than the actual thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm curious, not everybody can move. Not everybody can just overnight change, kind of who they're surrounding. But for those that are looking for inspiration, whether it's reading, it's listening to something, it's watching something, where do you pull inspiration from?
First and foremost, let me go back and just challenge one notion, which is this idea that you've got to get to someplace particular or specific. I think we're solving for the quadrant, not the coordinate. So it is of little value or consequence to me for someone to obsess over a coordinate. And that coordinate could be a certain job. It could be a certain place where you're living. It could be a certain income. It could be a certain whatever it is. But the quadrant is largely, am I in the right quadrant? And then celebrate that. If you're in the wrong quadrant, meaning wrong values, you're solving for the wrong things, you're not clear what's in your happiness quotient, then I will say that there aren't a lot of limitations that would keep you from making that move. The coordinates, that may be a little bit of a different thing. So that would be number one. Number two, there's some really great books that, and to really think about it and to read something and be like, yes, that's it. And there are a few authors who I think are just great. There's a book called Strength to Strength by Arthur Book. Great book.
Yep.
And he really addresses a lot of the things that I felt were, what is the next thing and how do I think about what I'm solving for? So that was a great book. I've talked about Adam Grant and, Think Again, but a lot of his books to me were great in that way. And then obviously, then stuff like The Portfolio Life by Christina Wallace was helpful. But all of these are books about people thinking about thinking, and books thinking about what's important and what we value. And some of that is become popularized in a way where it's kind of formulaic and almost kind of like brain candy. But some of it's really powerful and it's really been helpful for me. The last thing I would just say, Matt, is just I take risk and I'll have a conversation with you about real stuff. And you'll probably in turn have a conversation with me about real stuff, and we'll learn from each other. Like when you talk about your 20-year friendships, when you get together, like what are you guys talking about? I pledged a fraternity, and we my fraternity brothers, we celebrated 30 years in the fraternity, and we got together. We went to Cabo and we sat around in a hot tub and we did highs and lows. And the lows were as important, if not more important. And the highs is interesting. No one was talking about like some big career thing. They were talking about my daughter can now do this and my son is or things that like are really, really, we're finding to be important. So I have found those conversations to also be a source of growth and inspiration.
No, it's funny you mentioned Strength by Strength or Strength to Strength, because I just started reading it. And there were like 2 or 3 times where you were talking, I'm like, literally, like, I just read that. So definitely
read the follow-on book that he did with Oprah.
With Oprah. Yeah. Yeah. One thing I think that is it's been consistent with all the people I've talked to on the podcast is when you're able to be in integrity with yourself, it truly allows you to have that North Star, to know like the decisions I'm making, no matter how challenging or not, they make sense. And I'm okay with the results wherever they fall. So, and again, I'm making an assumption. It sounds like you're in integrity with yourself right now and been able to figure that out along your journey. Do you have any tips that people should apply to get to that position where you're not second guessing, even though, yes, I agree, there is that cloud coming of like, am I good enough? Or, imposter syndrome or what those things creep in. But as long as you're in that space where you feel good about, I'm doing this because of this reason, and that reason's aligned with who I'm as a person, how can people get there? Or what are some approaches they should take to think about?
It's hard. We as Homo sapiens are hardwired to belong. We're social animals, and belonging, the way that looks in modern day society is we want to be like the tribe. We want to look like the tribe. We want to do what the tribe does. We want the tribe to love us and accept us. It's what in my book I talk about, we crowdsource our happiness. If I'm having a great meal, before I even put the fork in the meal, I take a picture of it and I post it on Instagram, and I'm waiting for people to say, this is dope, that's amazing, where are you eating? Before I've even consumed my own happiness, I'm looking for validation. And we're crowdsourcing. And I almost enjoy the meal less if people didn't even acknowledge the post, which is sad. And then think about how that plays out in almost every aspect of your life. The work you do, you're looking for everyone to validate. The choices you make, did I make the right choice? I think the more we can spend time creating space for us to figure out who we really are, independent of what others want and expect or will advise. It's almost like I'm a scuba diver, so I spend a lot of time in waters, and it's given me a reason to like learn a lot about certain animals. And certain sharks will lay their young in like groves in areas where they'll be protected, and they're away from all the potential threats. And if they can just get big enough, they can one day go on and be a predator themselves. But for a period of time, they have to be protected in these really interesting spaces. Your inner self, your authentic self, has to be protected. You've got to give it time to grow. You've got to give it time before the predators, which are social media, peer pressure, family expectations, will like rip it apart. And it's not too late. You could be 80 years old and you might need to still go ahead and protect that inner part of you, because that part of you may have stopped growing at 13. It may have, right? And so how do you create space to figure out what brings you joy, what brings you purpose, what really is your the thing you're supposed to be doing? And before you turn up the volume, turn it down and give it some space to grow.
So one last question. If someone's following a path that looks similar to yours and they see some of the things you've done, they're like, I'd really like to figure out how to do that. What are your last words of advice to that person?
Don't look for wisdom in someone else's path. I know that's not the right answer that people probably expect to hear. You and I talked about this. One last thing I'll just say is our lives are more like scatter plots than these neat lines. But when someone asks you to tell them about your life, you tell it in this very neat, linear, almost like logical way, and it gives someone, unfortunately, their impression that that's the way their life should play out. Our life is more random, and it's more about adapting and being nimble than it is being determined. And so I would just say, if there's anything to learn from my scatter plot, it would be the white space. What are the things I did wrong? I'm so glad you asked about some of those things, the darkness, the failures, the things where you're still wrestling with it. Because quite honestly, that's, if anything, what someone can learn from. Because I tell you what, that's probably the only thing we're going to have in common, is that we're going to both struggle. Our successes will look different. How we define success will look different. So you shouldn't study my success. You should study like how I endure, how I navigated the things that we'll all have in common, which is the dark space or the white space, whichever it is. But that would be my nudge, is to not reverse engineer someone's bio, but to really understand some of that space.
If you want to hear more stories like this one, just search for What's Your Story with Matt Story, wherever you listen to podcasts. Click the follow so you don't miss out on any of our future episodes. And please leave a rating and a comment so others can find the pod as well. And lastly, if you want to follow me and see what I'm up to, just go to LinkedIn and search for Matt Story.